There are some books you pick up thinking, here's a wise man's behind-the-scenes account of world-changing decisions. And then halfway through, you realize you're basically reading a diplomatic press release, one that's been ironed, perfumed, and polished until the wrinkles of truth are almost invisible. Interventions, A Life in War and Peace by Kofi Annan is one of those books. And yet, like a plate of over-seasoned food, you can still taste the original ingredients if you scrape off enough sauce. Imagine the UN as a huge, chaotic family dinner. At the head of the table sits Uncle Sam, who not only orders the food but also decides who gets to eat, when, and how much. Next to him, Cousin Britain nods approvingly, occasionally chiming in with, "Yes, quite right." Down the table, there's Africa, polite, patient, hungry, waiting for a fair share of the meal. And presiding over this dinner, making sure everyone at least appears civil, is Kofi Annan. That's essentially the tone of Interventions. Annan recounts his years as UN Secretary General, telling us why intervention became such a central policy, and how he handled some of the most politically explosive moments in recent history. And in true memoir fashion, there's a healthy portion of self-defense. Like all memoirs, this one has that I need to explain my choices vibe. Part historical account, part please understand I did my best. Now, Annan doesn't shy away from mentioning that the US often did whatever it wanted. Iraq invasion, for instance, with or without UN approval. But he also peppers the book with moments where he supposedly pushed back, moments of independent thinking. You get the feeling he's saying, "See, I tried." But there are parts that make you want to put the book down and say, wait, what? Take this gem about Zimbabwe.
In 1965, the white minority government of southern Rhodesia thwarted the British intent on building a multiracial system.
Now, that sounds almost like Annan was disappointed the black majority fought back, as if the best course was for Zimbabweans to just smile and endure minority rule. He does acknowledge Robert Mugabe's land reforms, but frames them as aggressive and disastrous, basically echoing Western media talking points. Sure, Mugabe had his faults, but let's not pretend the land question in Zimbabwe wasn't a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, Annan showers admiration on Nelson Mandela, quoting him, cherishing him, but conveniently avoids discussing how post-apartheid South Africa still kept the same deeply skewed land ownership structure. Mandela's presidency didn't magically erase economic inequality, but Annan, he leaves that inconvenient fact in the shadows. When he talks about poor leadership in Africa, he's not wrong. But his silence on the West's role in removing or assassinating the continent's early visionary leaders is deafening. Patrice Lumumba? Gone, courtesy of Belgium and the CIA. Kwame Nkrumah? Toppled in a coup with Western fingerprints all over it. Mobutu Sese Seko, Idi Amin Mengistu? Supported when convenient. Annan mentions Mobutu, but skips how he came to power. Instead, the narrative is shaped as if African leaders emerged from a leadership lottery, and the bad ones just happened. Then comes my favorite eyebrow-raising moment. Annan wanted a research report explaining Africa's underdevelopment. The first report blamed colonialism, but Annan wasn't happy, so he ordered another one that blamed poor leadership. Now, as a researcher myself, I couldn't help laughing. That's like asking a tailor to make you a suit, but telling them in advance, make sure it's blue, even if the fabric is green.
Wait, what?
Annan also falls into the tired Ghana versus Malaysia comparison. You know, the one where Ghana was supposedly better off at independence, but Malaysia has since outpaced it. The missing context? Malaysia's Dr. Mahathir ruled for 22 years straight, something that, in Africa, would have earned him the label dictator. And the example of China? Annan praises its success in lifting millions out of poverty, while skipping the part where democracy had nothing to do with it. Then there's the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Annan paints it as a proud achievement, a step toward global justice. But the reality is messier. As Robin Cook admitted, the ICC wasn't built to prosecute leaders from powerful countries like the United States or the United Kingdom. Instead, it's the legal arm of Western geopolitics, a place where African leaders are far more likely to stand trial than anyone dropping bombs in Iraq or Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter's book, Our Endangered Values, makes it plain. the United States made sure its citizens had blanket immunity from the ICC. African nations were pressured to sign the non-surrender treaty or risk losing aid. Annan himself admits a U.S. judge once called the ICC a kangaroo court. And yet, the ICC still features as a proud note in his memoir, even after the Libya case, where rebels became peaceful demonstrators in the official story. Speaking of Libya, Annan calls the UN's involvement an intervention. But honestly, if you knew what was happening on the ground, you'd probably call it an invasion. He draws moral lines depending on geography, like UK riots, hooligans. But the Arab Spring? Suddenly they're courageous demonstrators. When it comes to agriculture, Annan champions a unique African green revolution. But well, he waits until 42 pages later to mention that Western farm subsidies are just crushing African farmers. U.S. cotton farmers get billions in subsidies while African producers starve under these trade imbalances. Dambisa Moyo, in Dead Aid, breaks this down just brilliantly. Annan responds kind of vaguely, almost like naming the problem too clearly might upset the donors.
Please, I'm blushing.
And then there's AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, chaired by none other than Annan himself, and funded heavily by the Gates Foundation with ties to GM crop interests. The Gates Foundation even has a stake in Monsanto. Annan's take? Governments can decide whether to adopt GM crops. But with dependency and profit motives in play, can they really decide freely?
No, man.
When the Iraq War comes up, Annan dances delicately. He avoids outright calling it illegal, at least until late in the book. The result is a long explanation of Saddam's behavior that leaves you, half convinced the invasion was inevitable. Even after Iraq became a breeding ground for terrorism, Annan maintains his diplomatic tone. On Syria, he frames armed rebels as youth pleading for accountable government, ignoring the geopolitical puppet strings behind the conflict. No word on Saudi Arabia's democratic credentials, of course. By the end, you're left with an Annan who excels at diplomacy, but also at sidestepping uncomfortable truths. He writes as if global politics happen in isolation, without acknowledging how deeply interconnected and honestly exploitative the system really is.
Where are you getting this information?
The book, Interventions: A Life in War and Peace by Kofi Annan, a memoir co-written with Nader Moussavezadeh, published in 2012 by Alan Lane. This is not a book I would have rushed to read, but I'm glad I did. It's eye-opening, not necessarily because of what it says, but because of what it leaves unsaid. The omissions speak loudly. The silences between the lines are where the real story hides. Annan presents himself as a careful, balanced mediator. And perhaps that's true. But in his effort to maintain diplomatic tone, he often glosses over the systemic injustices driving the very conflicts he describes. He names African failings without fully naming Western complicity. He praises global institutions without acknowledging how they're rigged to protect the powerful. It's also interesting to watch him indirectly spar with critics like Dambisa Moyo, defending aid, defending interventionism, defending the ICC, without really dismantling their arguments. What the book does well is give you a front-row seat to the mechanics of diplomacy, the negotiations, the wordsmithing, the carefully managed public image. What it does less well is grapple with the deeper truths about global inequality, imperialism, and how international rules are selectively enforced. Kofi Annan, who lived from 1938 to 2018, was a Ghanaian diplomat who served as the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations from 1997 to 2006. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2001 alongside the UN for work in revitalizing the organization and prioritizing human rights. After his UN tenure, Annan worked on global development, agriculture, and conflict resolution projects, including chairing AGRA. His memoir, Interventions, co-written with Nader Moussavezadeh, seeks to explain and defend his decisions during a decade of unprecedented global crises, from Iraq to Rwanda, from Kosovo to Darfur. It's part personal history, part political narrative, and part self-vindication. So, should you read Interventions? If you're interested in how the UN sees itself and how its former leader wants to be remembered, then yes. Just keep your critical reading glasses on and remember, The most important parts are sometimes hidden between the lines. Hey, thanks so much for hanging out with me today. If you're interested in diving deeper into this book, I've left some links down in the description. You can use it to grab yourself a copy and keep the adventure going. And if you're in the mood for more great reads, don't go just yet. Click on one of the videos popping up right now that I think you'll love. And don't forget to give this review a like, leave a comment, or even subscribe if you'd like to see more. Every bit of support helps us grow this little community of book lovers. See you in the next one.